Everybody, if you want to come on back together, there's notes in the back if anybody needs notes. Tonight we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 tonight. I'm going to mention this again on Sunday, but I want to point this out to you guys regards the upcoming elections. In the back you will find this. This is a voter's guide, and this gives policy information for different candidates for the primary elections coming up. This is a good thing to get. It's not going to tell you how to vote, but it's going to help you to cast an informed ballot. So I'd encourage you to grab one of those in the back. And I wanted to mention something else about the youth event tomorrow that I'm going to be teaching. Some of you might remember some years ago I did a small-scale version of this. I'm going to be teaching on the armor of God in Ephesians, and I have it's not a super authentic, but it's to the specs, a reproduction first-century Roman shield. Some of you have seen my gladius, my Roman sword that I keep in my office, and we're going to be talking about the armor of God and showing, rather than just telling kids, how those things worked together and what Paul had in mind when he talks about the sword of the Spirit and the shield of faith. So pray for that. Pray that I have wisdom, because I really want the kids involved and interactive, and I'm going to give them opportunities to practice what you would do with that equipment. And I really do not need a teenager to stab another teenager, or me, or anything like that. So I'm going to step out on faith a little bit. But tonight we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and this is a very interesting passage. Paul has been going through Corinthians, dealing with specific issues that the church in Corinth faces. They've got these issues of physical immorality, they've got these relationship issues, they've got these issues of greed, and they're all suing each other. They've got all these kinds of issues. And now they're going to come to an issue that's very relevant for Christians today, especially young people today, which is why we invited the teens in to be with us. We're going to pick up in verse 25. Let's ask the Lord's blessing and we'll get started. God, thank you for this night that you've given us. Thank you for this opportunity to be in your word. Help us to grow in grace and to know you better. God, I pray that you would bless the discussion, that you would help us to walk away with practical applications in ways that we can be better for you. In Jesus' name, amen. And as always, the hope is that this is a discussion. So let me paint the picture a little bit and tell the story why chapter 7, verse 25 through 40 happened, and what the question is. So you're a Christian in Corinth. You are ready to step out into adulthood. You are grown up. It is time for you to be an adult. You're 14 years old. That's, about roughly the time frame. We might say 16, 17, 18, but they did things a little bit younger. And you have to make a choice. Do you get married? Do you get married? I mean, we're Christians. We believe Jesus could come back at any moment. And also, there's horrible persecution just on the horizon. Life is not easy. Do we really want to get married and raise kids in a world like this? That's the question the people in Corinth have to answer 2,000 years ago. And it's very relevant to us today. So let's discuss it a little bit. What's better for a Christian? Getting married or not getting married? Which is better? Say again? Paul says, the married man says, stay. Right after Patty left, the married man, oh, she's still here. No. Paul says staying single. Why single?
Because you get to care for the things of Christ. You're more free to practice the liberty of the Spirit.
Okay, so Paul talks about caring for the things of Christ and the liberty of the Spirit, which is interesting. There's a way in which a single person has more freedom, and also a single person must be much more disciplined. We'll talk about that in time. What about for team marriage? Anybody for marriage? We got one hand. A lot of married people in here, only one and a half hands. We'll talk about that. You're right. You're right. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I'll go ahead and address this now. We've seen this already in 1 Corinthians. Everybody seems to have one of two great giftings, one of two tremendous and special gifts. And the one gift is marriage, and the other gift is singleness. And the people that are gifted with singleness are on the same level, on the same plane, and have the same capabilities as a person who is gifted with marriage. Now, what they can do functionally is different, in the same way that a man is different from a woman. But these two people are of equal dignity before the Lord and capable of special things within their lane, whether singleness or marriage. But people that choose singleness, they ought to choose it very deliberately. I would say kind of like how you choose marriage, right? Let's say you decide you're full of passion, you're 16 and a half, and you want to get married, and you elope and you get married. And then 2 years later, you're like, oh, I don't think marriage is really for me. I think I actually have the gift of singleness after I tried marriage. That's not legitimate. No, once you're in, you're in. Well, the same kind of thing, and it's not a shut door. Singleness is not a shut door. But the same kind of thing is going to be true for the gift of singleness. If you pursue the life of singleness, then you ought to pursue it with seriousness. Not say, I have the gift of singleness until you meet a cute person that you like. Oh, I guess I don't have the gift of singleness anymore. The point is that these giftings require pursuit. That's something that we've seen in the passage. But we had a reason. Paul gave a reason why a Christian should not get married. What's a reason why a Christian should get married? Skylar? Yeah. Yeah, marriage. We know that marriage is a calling of God. Not all marriages are good, but a marriage is a calling of God because who invented marriage? God invented marriage and called the first married people into marriage. So either is good. And this is what Paul is going to say now. So the situation is these young Christians in Corinth, they're 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. They've converted. They didn't grow up in the church. Nobody grew up in the church yet. They're young adult converts. They're probably engaged because almost everybody is getting engaged by their family pretty early on. And so now things are different. They're Christians. They're under persecution. And they're looking at each other and they have to ask the question, should we really get married? Should we try to raise kids in this world when Jesus could come back at any moment and we don't even know if we'll live to see tomorrow? That's the question they're answering. So let's look at what Paul says. We'll pick up in verse 25. Oh, by the way, these young people, in the King James, they're called virgins. It's not a bad translation, but that's just that whenever you read virgin in this passage, we're talking about a young person who's engaged to be married, but not physically married yet. Now, concerning virgins, Paul says this, I have no commandment of the Lord. This is really interesting. Paul's saying, I'm not going to give you a proof text here. But I'm going to give my judgment, Paul says. I'm going to give my opinion as one that has obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. And Paul is still inspired, but he's being transparent. This isn't something that Jesus taught us about. We don't have a black and white answer from Jesus on this question. But as an apostle of Christ, Paul's going to give his answer. And as he tells us in this chapter, he has the Spirit of God. And he says this in verse 26, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. And we're talking about singleness here, to be alone. Now, the present distress, it could describe just the messed upness of the world, or it could describe persecution that's about to happen at the church at Corinth. Probably it describes both. Paul is saying here in verse 26 that singleness is good. Just singleness is a good life in the present world. And I think this is a message that the churches need to hear, because as Christians, often we rush to get married. And if you got married young, I'm not saying you did a bad thing. But as Christians, we often rush to get married. When I was in my 20s and a Christian and not married, I remember distinctly, especially some older men, putting a lot of pressure on me. Essentially, what is wrong with you? Is there something secretly wrong with you that you're not looking for a wife? That is something that our culture can do. But Paul's saying, given the circumstance, actually it's good for a person to be single. But that doesn't mean that you should just run off from your family if you have one, as verse 27 clarifies. Would somebody read that for us? 1 Corinthians 7:27.
Are you bound to a wife? Do you not seek to be free? Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife.
And so what we see here is Paul is saying, look, if you're bound to a wife, if you're married, I'm not saying you need to end your marriage because Jesus is coming back and it's time to get to work. That's not the idea. Live out your calling in your marriage. If you're not married, and this is interesting, Paul is saying, well, what's he saying in verse 27? If you're not married, what's he saying? Yeah, stay single, or don't change your status, which is interesting because a lot of people get married and it doesn't seem to be a sin. So let's put on our Bible interpretation hat and think critically and carefully about the passage. Paul is saying here, in this present circumstance, probably a good idea if you don't get married. How does that different from our circumstance right now? Or what's going on here? Is this a command that we shouldn't get married? No. So what's going on?
I think it's based on the current, you have to put it in context, right? And I know that's where we're headed, but to me it makes sense logically that if you know that there's impending danger as a believer, you would be knowingly endangering whoever you tied yourself with as a spouse. You're basically pulling them into that same danger along with you.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's, he's saying, why would you knowingly endanger someone else knowing that this persecution is coming?
So Jared points this out. Why would you knowingly endanger someone else knowing that this persecution is coming? You might remember the story of the founding of the church at Corinth. When Paul first arrived at Corinth, he had to be comforted by Jesus. Don't be afraid. Stay in this city. I have many people here. Paul fled from one city to the next. Savage beatings and huge riots followed him wherever he went. And the church at Corinth knew that persecution was coming, or they were living in it. And so in this very specific situation, Paul is saying to them, if you're not married, I think it's a good idea if you stay single, because you don't know what's going to happen next. Now, we live in a little bit of a different situation, but the important principle to see here is that God can and does bless marriage and can and does bless singleness, but those things ought not to just be jumped into. They ought to be entered into intentionally, based on your giftings and your circumstance. And ultimately what Paul is doing here is he's telling people, count the cost. Before you get married, count the cost. Think about what it's going to cost. Now, I don't mean the wedding, but I mean what's going to happen. He says in verse 28, if you marry, Paul's kind of giving his opinion here. You know what? Based on the circumstances, I think it'd be a good idea if you engaged folks didn't get married right now and maybe just devoted yourself to singleness. But, you know what? If you got married, Paul says in verse 28, is it a sin? No. If you marry, it's not a sin. If a virgin, if a young engaged person marries, she's not sinned. Nevertheless, this is the cost. What's the cost of marriage in verse 28? Troubles in the flesh. There will be troubles in the flesh. Marriage brings troubles in the flesh. Marriage is a wonderful thing, but marriage brings trouble. And incidentally, even kind of loose and open hookups with people also bring trouble, but more trouble. I had somebody tell me recently that we were talking about a person who's going through a really hard time and making a lot of poor choices, and that person happens to be single. And this other individual I was talking to said, man, I just wish they would find a spouse. If they just got married, I think things would be better for them. Marriage brings trouble. Marriage brings trouble in the flesh. When you get married, it doesn't make your problems go away. It actually magnifies. In my experience, it magnifies them. Pastor Keith?
I think the one thing to keep in mind is the emphasis he's putting on why you remain single, because you can devote yourself better to the Lord. Most young people nowadays who decide not to get married, it's not because they want to devote themselves more fully to the Lord.
Yes, yes. And this is a theme that we see. I've been calling it the redemption principle. A teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that we do not belong to ourselves. You are not your own. If you're a Christian, you belong to God. And so when you're making choices, you ought not to be making the choice based on what Skylar wants. Okay, what do I want to do? The choice ought to be made based on what is God's will, what glorifies God, what reflects truth the best. And so Paul is saying here, hey, you're going to have trouble in the flesh if you marry. That doesn't mean it's a sin, but do not rush into a marriage thinking that a marriage is just going to make your life blissful. And once I get married, everything's going to be great.
What are some of those examples of trouble in the flesh?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Paul asks an interesting question. What are some examples of trouble in the flesh? Well, who was the first married couple to have trouble? Okay, well, let's talk about flesh first. When Paul talks about flesh, he's mostly describing like the human sin nature and the parts of our life and soul that are touched by sin and kind of messed up. And so when you think about being messed up by sin and how that affects relationships, who were the first people in the Bible to have that trouble in the flesh? Yeah, Adam and Eve. In fact, that seems to be part of the curse. What God said to Adam and Eve is hard to understand, but he said to Eve, your desire shall be to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And what that means is hard to understand, but the gist is you're not going to get along as you should. It doesn't mean you're going to be miserable all the time, but you're not going to get along like you should. And so marital discord, not getting along like you should, is an example of trouble in the flesh. What are some other examples?
Financial pressure,
Yeah.
expenses, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, financial pressures. Kids, yes. Trouble in the flesh, yes. Trouble in the flesh. Yeah, and
I think you still have to keep it in context, right? I mean, we're 2 verses away from the active persecution that's going on, and to me the concept is once you're tied to a second person, everything's amplified.
yes,
The expenses are amplified, pressures are amplified, the strife is amplified because you can't just, I'll talk to you in the morning. It's, I'll see you after I change clothes.
yep,
Everything is just amplified, and so the persecution is amplified because you're not just worried now about your physical well-being, you're worried about hers, or she's worried about his, or they're worried about something happening to their kids and what's going to happen to the kids if something happens. So everything, this trouble in the flesh, everything is just
amplified, yeah.
once you hit that stage.
Jared's using an insightful word, amplified. Marriage amplifies troubles in the flesh, and especially because you now have to worry about another person. And not only do you have to worry about them, but you guys don't always get along. And so it's this weird thing where you're worried about somebody, but you don't always get along, and so you fight. And when you fight, you're miserable because, you don't like to lose fights, but you also don't like to see your spouse lose, and it's trouble in the flesh. This is part of the cost of marriage. Is this a deal breaker? No. But this is part of the cost of marriage. And too many people run into marriage thinking, hey, this is going to solve my problem, when marriage is not going to solve your problem. And if you face difficulty in life, poverty, in America, we hardly know what poverty is, but I was counseling with somebody who's poor for American standards and very upset about it. And God allows people to go through that trial. If you face poverty, you face illness, you face just tiredness and fatigue. I don't think Heather would mind. This is a discussion we had recently. It seems like the last month, Heather and I hardly see each other. It's like we work in the same factory on different shifts. We kind of see each other coming and going. And we used to be great about date nights, and we're not great about date nights right now. And I told her, I promised her, we are going to get better at this. We are going to find a way to spend time together again. And that's just the life of marriage. So count the cost before you get married. This is the extreme example, this living under persecution. This is the extreme example, but the principles apply to our lives too, even if we're not under persecution. Because ultimately, deciding to be married or single isn't a decision about what you like the most. It's a decision about where the focus of your life should be. What is your gifting and where should the focus of your life be? We see in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29, "But I say, brethren," and this is, probably this is describing immediate persecution, but there's a kind of end times flavor to all of this, because we don't know when the world will end. "But I say this, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they weep not, they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, they that buy as though they possess not." It's kind of a riddle, right? Like, how do you be somebody who has a spouse and as though you didn't have a spouse? And Paul's point is that we have the spouse that God has given us, but we need to live with a realization that at any minute God could call us home, or we could both pass away. At any minute, everything could change. And so, yes, this is the situation right now, but the time is short. There's a kind of urgency to life, and even an unpredictability. And for that reason, what should we do according to verse 31? Because everything is passing away, what should we do according to verse 31? Well, let's read the verse first. Would somebody read for us 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 31?
They that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passes away.
So this whole world is passing away. And so we ought to make use of the things of this world, but not misuse them. Not use them for the wrong purpose or depend on them in the wrong way. Not even marriage. And Paul gives the principle of focus in verses 32 through 33. The person that's married, somebody already mentioned this, the person that's unmarried, a single person, is able to focus on the things of God more clearly because they're single and they don't have family pressures to worry about. A person with a family, well, you see, in verse 33, a person with a family has to learn to tell his family to bug off so he can serve God. Is that what verse 33 says? No. He that is married cares for the things of the world, how he may please his wife. The person with the family serves God by taking care of his family. Now there's more to it than that. But taking care of your family, if you are called to marriage, is part of the way that you are serving God. It is full of significance and purpose for that reason. There's a difference between the wife and the virgin, the married woman and just the betrothed woman. The unmarried woman cares for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married cares for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And Paul's pretty upfront with it as he wraps up this part of the argument. I speak this for your profit. I'm not trying to trap you. I just want you to do what's appropriate, to be able to attend to the Lord, according to the end of verse 35, to attend to the Lord how? Without distraction. And that's why Paul keeps saying, I think singleness is a really good idea. You guys are young and in love and stuff, and you're all super excited to get married. You ought to think about singleness. Especially because the world's falling apart. And at least don't rush into it. Because when you're single, those precious years when you're single, you are able to serve God without distraction in a special way. And that's Paul's point here. But again, he says in verse 36, if you marry, you're not sinning if you're called to marriage. And if you pursue it the right way. If any man thinks that he's behaving himself unseemly or inappropriate to his virginity, you're engaged to somebody, and they really want to get married, and you think, yeah, I think I would be wrong at this point. You're not sinning if you do actually get married, if it's an appropriate marriage. So marriage is no sin, but sometimes singleness is better. And this is the paradox. I'm saying singleness, singleness, singleness because Paul keeps talking about it. And I'm making singleness sound great because Paul keeps doing that and talking about how when you're single, it's great because you're at liberty to serve God and life is easy when you're single. But actually, it's kind of a paradox. Singleness requires more discipline to do right. That's how he ends the passage. When you're single, it's not that you get to be less disciplined. Like I have a friend who's a truck driver, over-the-road truck driver, and has no family. And I wouldn't want that life. But I think about it now and then. Like, what would that life be like? Over-the-road truck driver, no family. Like what do? You just like make money and like you have money all the time and you don't have bills, and I wouldn't want that life. But it sounds a lot easier than the family way. Yeah, well, I'm a loner. But here's the thing. Singleness done right, biblical singleness, requires as much, if not more, discipline than marriage. But where in marriage, your spouse helps you to be disciplined, and you got to take life seriously because you got that mortgage payment. That mortgage payment kind of keeps you in line. For the single person, you have to apply your own discipline, or discipline directly from God. That's why Paul describes it this way in verse 37. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his will, and has so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. What that's describing is a couple who is engaged, but agreed, we are going to live the single life. I love you, but look, the world is falling apart. We want to serve God as best as we can in the present distress. We want to get married, I know, but we're going to live the single life. That requires enormous discipline. Physical discipline, spiritual discipline, emotional discipline. And so Paul goes on to describe this, the ways that singleness is better in the present distress. And this is the big picture. The answer to the question, should a Christian marry? It depends on your giftings. It depends on the circumstances. But understand that the single life done right is just as good, just as legitimate, and ultimately just as fulfilling as the married life. So what can we say to this? Let's talk application. Do people ever get married for the wrong reasons? All the time. How does Paul arm us against getting married for the wrong reasons? In this passage, what's he doing? He's working really hard to remind us that singleness is a good thing. And we need to remember that. Singleness is a good thing. How else is Paul arming us against marriage for the wrong reasons? What's the stabilizing truth here? This is something you look for. The truth in the passage that helps you be stable and steadfast and not squirrely and doing weird stuff. The truth in the passage that helps you sit where you ought to be and not fall. How does Paul arm us against getting married for the wrong reasons? In verse 28, trouble in the flesh. Is marriage going to solve your problem? No. You have problems with an impure thought life, marriage is not going to solve that problem. For example, Jared?
I think it even ties back into 27. I mean, you think of the persecution that was going on then and the absolute horrific circumstances that they were living through as first-generation believers. It didn't release them from the vow. The vow stands still. And we face nothing like it, especially today here in America, by comparison. And yet, the vow is so much more fragile than it is now.
Yes.
What he's encouraging is maintain the status quo, not do certain things.
I think that's an interesting point Jared makes. It's almost so obvious it's easy to miss. Paul never gives an option for get married now, and if it doesn't work out and the persecution strikes up, then you don't have to be married anymore. That's not an option. But as Americans, that might be our primary option. Hey, we'll try it out. We'll get married. You know what? We don't even need to get married. We'll live together for a little while, and if it works out, then it works out. That's a terrible idea. If I'm making it sound good, that's because how people talk. But that is a terrible idea. Don't do that. Paul, that's just not an option. Like, once you're married, you're married. Like, you are in it to the end. Whatever that end is, you are in it to the end. And so Paul is arming us against getting married for the wrong reasons, but it is good to get married if God is calling you to marriage. The point is, the big picture is that whether we're married or single, whatever gifting you do, whatever vocation of life you pursue, your life is not your own. Who does the married person's life belong to? Your partner. Your kids, yeah. No, your money belongs to your kids. Who does the single person's life belong to? To Christ. And yeah, the married person's life belongs to Christ too, but in a less direct way. The single person, if they're pursuing singleness biblically, just as the married person is all in for their spouse, the single person is all in for Christ. That is a very serious commitment. And so the big picture, the insight, whether you're married or single, your life is not your own. You don't get to keep your life. In fact, that's good, because true life, like real, genuine life worth living, is found in love. And love is selfless. So what are some other insights? What are some takeaways from this that you guys see, or questions that you have? Pastor Keith?
I just want to make a couple comments. I think when we look at the beginning of chapter 7, Paul started off by saying, because of the temptation to immorality, let every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband. So he started off with that as the norm. And then you go back to Genesis. Just last week I was teaching on Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. God originated marriage, and he said it's not good for the man to be alone. And he made a wife for him. And so I think overall, when we look at the total biblical picture, not just 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the normal thing for most people is to get married. And if we don't do that, we don't propagate the human race, and the human race will come to extinction.
Right.
And in our culture today, that is the biggest danger, because many young people are not getting married, not for the right reasons, not so they can serve God, for their own selfish reasons, because they want to avoid problems, they don't want any trouble, they want to just do what they want to do, and they're selfish. And we're facing a crisis in America right now because there aren't enough children to go into the workforce to meet the needs of the workforce, and all the people who are retired, there's not going to be anybody to pay into their Social Security. I mean, this is a problem in America, it's a problem in Europe, huge problem in Europe, Japan, China, many countries around the world. There aren't enough young people now because people have chosen either not to get married or not to have any children.
Japan is the biggest one. I think in Japan, people are dying at twice the rate they're being born. And so marriage is God's plan for the majority of the human race. Marriage is good and holy. The point is that it's not better than singleness for people that have been called to be single.
It's perfectly well put.
Right.
But that's the whole key. You're right. It has to be God's choice for you.
And that's,
God needs to make that
Yeah.
clear. If he wants you to be single, he'll make it clear. You may not like it, but you need to obey him if it's what he wants you to do.
And this is the hard thing, because we're like, man, I want to live my life. I want to go out and I want to live my life, just like my favorite influencer tells me to do. At the end of the day, what we're saying, married or single, is we're saying my life is not my own. And the paradoxical thing is that when you give your life to God, he gives it back to you better than it was before. But what else can we say to this, just practically? So you're burning with a desire to get married. Do you immediately go out and do it? I would say no, because you don't know the circumstances. You probably don't know your gifting. Things are a little different when you're older. Heather and I met and dated and got engaged, and that whole period was a year. We were both knocking on the door of 30, which is, inconceivably old. But we were mature. We had some life experience at that point. If I was 24 or 20 or 19 or whatever, that could have been absolute disaster. One of the things that Paul is doing here is he's saying, take the present circumstance into consideration when you're trying to make this decision. And the reality is what you want may not be God's will for your life. And you may not know what's best for you. And so whatever you're doing, don't be in a rush. That's one of Paul's big points here. What are some other practical things that we can say to this? Just ways to approach life. Paul?
I think the lesson is learn to sacrifice and be sacrificially loving others.
Yeah.
Because if you're married, you're going to have to do it. If you're single, you're called to do it. The more we live sacrificially, the greater our joy and the greater our success in life.
That's one of
believer is.
that is one of Paul the Apostle's big points. Is the life of marriage is a life of sacrifice. A life of singleness isn't the life of ease. The life of singleness also is the life of sacrifice. It's just a question of how you're going to do that. That's one of Paul's really big points, that our lives are not our own, whatever path you choose. And so you arm yourself with that knowledge and say, give your life to God. God, this is my life. Do with it what you will. Teach me how to follow you. That's what our mindset ought to be. Any other practical points? We're about out of time. Big takeaways? All right, well, I think a productive discussion tonight. Let's go to the Lord. God, thank you for this night that you've given us. Bless us in your word and help us to discern your will, and help us most to trust in your person, to do good as we understand it in your name. Lord, help us to not try to live our own lives, but to live the life that you intend for us, knowing that it will be better in the end. And whether you call us to marriage or singleness, teach us contentment in you. We pray this in your name. Amen. If you want to read ahead, next Wednesday we will do chapter 8.